Hey everyone, and welcome back. Ready to dive into a topic that's well, surprisingly relevant, even though it's, ancient history.
Always up for a good history lesson, especially when it connects to the present.
Right. So today we're tackling Athenian democracy. And no, not just a quick glance at the textbook version. We're going deep, folks. We're talking about the nitty-gritty, the inner workings, the stuff that makes you see how those Athenian folks, way back when, still influence how we think about government today.
And that's the fascinating part, isn't it? How this system, thousands of years old, still sparks debates and inspires political movements even now.
Totally. And to guide us on this journey, we're drawing a lot from Josiah Ober's work, especially his piece, Can We Learn from Ancient Athenian Democracy?
Hmm.
But as Ober points out, we're not exactly breaking new ground with this question, right?
Not at all. I mean, think about it. Athenian democracy has captivated minds for centuries. Early on, it was often seen as a cautionary tale, like, look what happens when democracy goes off the rails.
Yeah, bit of a hot mess express, at least in some people's eyes.
Exactly, but then you fast forward to the 19th century and suddenly it's all the rage. Thinkers like John Stuart Mill were all about Athenian democracy as a model for modern government.
Talk about a historical comeback. But you know what really changed the game? Archaeology.
Oh, absolutely. Digging up those ancient meeting minutes, court records, all right there in the heart of Athens. Game changer.
No kidding. It's like getting a glimpse into their actual conversations, And what those discoveries revealed, well, it was a system unlike anything we see today. No checks and balances as we know them, lots of government positions chosen by lottery.
Can you imagine? Congratulations, Bob. You're in charge of the Treasury this week.
I know, right? And short terms, strict accountability, they were serious about keeping power from getting too concentrated. But speaking of power, we have to talk about the Council of 500.
Ah, yes, the council. Think of it like the beating heart of Athenian democracy.
So not just some bureaucratic afterthought. This council was a big deal.
Huge. It's even echoed in inscriptions from other Greek cities. This wasn't just an Athenian thing. This system had reach.
Okay, so spill the tea. How did this all-important council actually work?
Picture this. 500 citizens, chosen randomly, serving for just 1 year. They set the agenda for the Athenian assembly where laws were debated and voted on.
So it's like a constantly rotating group of your neighbors deciding what issues mattered most.
Exactly. And because these council members came from all walks of life, different neighborhoods, professions, backgrounds, it created this incredible web of connections across the city.
I can only imagine the debates, the gossip, the sheer Athenianness of it all.
Oh, absolutely. And by the time their year was up, these citizens had this incredible depth of experience, a network that extended far beyond their own social circles. It's a level of civic engagement that's, well, pretty hard to imagine today.
So last time, we were really digging into how Athenian democracy, really put power in the hands of everyday people. But how did they keep things from, totally falling apart? It's not like they had, a constitution or Supreme Court to keep things in check.
Well, they had their own ways of maintaining order, and their legal system is a great example of that, specifically the people's courts.
Oh, yeah, the people's courts. Giant juries, right, by hundreds of regular folks deciding cases instead of, professional judges. It's a pretty wild concept when you really think about it.
It really is, and it gets even more interesting. Imagine a courtroom where anyone could argue their own case directly to the jury. No lawyers, no legal jargon, just, well, pure Athenian persuasion.
Wow, talk about taking justice into your own hands, literally. But that must have been a bit chaotic at times, right? How did they make sure things were actually fair?
That's where their emphasis on procedural justice comes in. Instead of focusing on, reaching the right outcome based on some strict code, they prioritized making sure everyone felt heard.
So it was less about, here's the law, case closed, and more about making sure every voice was heard, even if things get a little, shall we say, lively.
Exactly. And, there's actually a lot of modern research suggesting that this focus on procedural justice, on making people feel heard, can actually make them more likely to respect the law in the long run.
Interesting. So it's like they understood that sometimes the process, the feeling of fairness, is just as important as the actual outcome. But what about consistency? If every jury is just winging it, didn't that lead to, totally unpredictable results?
You're right to point that out, and the Athenians weren't totally oblivious to that concern. While they generally favored giving juries a lot of leeway, there were exceptions. For example, when it came to complex financial disputes, contracts, trade agreements, they did have stricter guidelines.
So they understood that in some areas, especially when it came to something as vital as the economy, you need a bit more, shall we say, predictability.
Precisely. But let's move from the courtroom to another fascinating aspect of Athenian democracy: public speaking, or what they called rhetoric. Remember, in Athens, decisions weren't just made by voting. Persuasion played a huge role.
Okay, see, now rhetoric always makes me think of like politicians using fancy words to manipulate people. But you're saying it was more than that in ancient Athens.
Absolutely. Think of it this way. In Athens, being able to articulate your ideas clearly and persuasively, it wasn't just an asset, it was essential. Whether you were debating in the assembly, arguing a case in court, or even just trying to convince your neighbor to support a new policy.
So in a way, it's a very democratic idea, right? Anyone who could command an audience could potentially shape policy. But then again, not everyone's a natural-born speaker. Wouldn't they give an advantage to, the smooth talkers, the Athenian equivalent of a charismatic politician?
That's a question that's been debated for centuries. Plato, for example, was very wary of rhetoric. He believed it could be used to deceive and manipulate, that true knowledge was more important than slick talking points.
Which, fair point.
Yeah.
But I guess it depends on how it's used, right? Like any tool, it can be used for good or, well, not so good.
Exactly. Now, speaking of wielding power in Athenian democracy, we have to talk about one of its most, shall we say, infamous practices: ostracism.
Ah, yes, ostracism. The Athenian art of saying, see ya later, by literally carving someone's name on a piece of pottery and sending them into exile for 10 years. It's a pretty intense way to deal with someone you disagree with.
It certainly captures the imagination, doesn't it? And while it might seem harsh, even cruel at first glance, it's important to remember that the Athenians didn't see it that way.
Oh, really? How so?
Well, for the Athenians, ostracism wasn't so much about punishing an individual as it was about preserving the stability of the democracy itself. Think of it as a way to diffuse potentially destructive conflicts, especially among ambitious, powerful elites.
This is like a preemptive strike against tyranny. Like, let's not wait for one person to get too big for their britches.
Yeah.
We have a system for that.
Oh, you got it. And while the threat of ostracism was certainly real, the process itself was, well, surprisingly civilized. There was a vote, a threshold had to be met, and even then, the person ostracized didn't lose their citizenship or their property. It was more like a forced timeout to cool things down.
It's a reminder that maintaining a democracy requires, well, constant vigilance, right?
Right.
And maybe willingness to use some unconventional methods. And, speaking of unconventional, we have to talk about one of the most fascinating things about Athenian democracy: their love of writing everything down.
Ah, yes, their epigraphic habit, as scholars call it. Laws, decrees, financial records, they carved it all in stone for everyone to see. Talk about transparency.
It's like they invented open government centuries before the internet. And what's amazing is that it wasn't just about making information available. They went to great lengths to make sure these inscriptions were actually understandable to the public.
Absolutely. They use specific language, formulas in these inscriptions, what one scholar calls formula of disclosure, to emphasize that they were meant to be read and understood by everyone.
It's like they were hardwiring accountability into the very fabric of their society. Right?
Yeah.
Because if you don't know what your leaders are doing, how can you hold them accountable? And how can you have a true democracy if information is hidden from the people it's supposed to serve?
Couldn't have said it better myself. But all this talk about participation, accountability, the power of the people, it makes you wonder, what did it actually mean to be an Athenian citizen? What values and beliefs shaped their sense of identity within this, well, radical system of government?
It's like mind-blowing when you think about it, right? Just the act of participating, voting, serving on juries, even reading those inscriptions out in the open, it shaped their entire worldview. It makes you wonder, do our own systems, our rituals, have that same power to shape who we are today?
It's a question that gets to the heart of what it meant to be an Athenian, and it sparked some pretty intense debates among scholars. Some argue that Athenian civic ideology was something completely new, a clean break from those old aristocratic values.
A total system reboot.
Exactly. Like they were inventing a whole new way of thinking about leadership, about the potential of everyday people.
But not everyone buys into that idea, right?
Right. Some scholars see it differently. They argue that, sure, Athenian democracy was groundbreaking, but it wasn't a complete rejection of the past. It was more like layering those democratic ideals onto existing social structures.
So those old hierarchical worldviews never completely vanished.
Exactly. It's a bit of a chicken and egg situation, isn't it? Did Athenian democracy create a new kind of citizen, Or did those pre-existing values shape how their democracy worked?
Deep stuff. But I guess no matter how you slice it, there's no denying that freedom and equality were like the cornerstones of Athenian citizenship.
Absolutely. Though, as we've touched on before, their definitions of those ideals might have sounded a little different back then.
Right, it wasn't all liberté, égalité, fraternité, just like that.
Yeah. Exactly. When the Athenians talked about freedom, they often connected it to the freedom of their city-state, the polis. They knew what it meant to be under the thumb of outside forces, so their independence was everything.
So individual freedom went hand in hand with this idea of collective freedom, the freedom of the community as a whole.
Exactly. It really makes you think about that balance between individual liberties and the needs of the state, a debate that's, well, never really gone away. But of course, we can't talk about Athenian freedom and equality without addressing the, shall we say, elephant in the room.
Yeah, slavery. It's impossible to ignore. It definitely exposes the limits of Athenian democracy.
Absolutely. A dark side we can't shy away from. But it's interesting that even in that context, their idea of freedom also included protection from an overly intrusive state. They valued the right to live your life as you saw fit, within the law, of course.
So it was about setting boundaries, even on the government itself.
Exactly. They had this idea of what we might call negative liberty today, the freedom from interference. And when it came to equality, well, their system was similarly complex. It wasn't about everyone having the exact same things. It was more about ensuring equal standing before the law, equal opportunity to participate in the political system.
Right. So a shepherd from the countryside had just as much right to speak his mind in the assembly as, like, a wealthy merchant. Pretty radical for the time. But it wasn't just about formal rights, was it?
Not at all. The Athenians also placed a high value on personal dignity, mutual respect. They even had laws against hubris, which basically meant acting like you were better than others, especially those from a lower social class.
No Athenian mean girls then.
Not if they could help it. It just goes to show that a healthy democracy is about more than just rules and institutions. It's about cultivating a certain spirit, a sense of shared respect and understanding, even when disagreements arise.
Well said. But even with all that, Athenian democracy wasn't without its critics, even back then, right? I mean, some folks straight up said the system was too chaotic, too easily swayed by the whims of the crowd.
Exactly. There were concerns about mob rule, about the majority trampling on the rights of the minority, and then there was the issue of expertise. With so many decisions being made by everyday citizens, some worried that the system lacked, real expertise, especially in complex areas like finance or warfare.
It's a tough question, isn't it? Can a system built on widespread participation really handle the complexities of running a society, or does it inevitably lead to, well, chaos? It's something we're still grappling with today.
Absolutely. And perhaps the most powerful example of these tensions, the potential pitfalls of Athenian democracy, is the trial and execution of Socrates.
Yes, Socrates, the philosopher who said the unexamined life is not worth living, and then got sentenced to death by his own city. Talk about irony.
Right. It's a story that's both fascinating and deeply unsettling. Was it a tragic miscarriage of justice, proof that even the most enlightened democracies can fall prey to fear and intolerance? Or was Socrates, as some argue, a victim of his own hubris, pushing the boundaries of free speech a bit too far?
It's one of those historical head-scratchers that probably won't ever have a neat answer.
Probably not, but maybe that's the point. Athenian democracy, for all its flaws and contradictions, wasn't afraid to wrestle with those big, messy questions. They confronted uncomfortable truth, they engaged in passionate debate, even when it meant challenging the powers that be.
And that, my friends, is a powerful lesson, even or maybe especially today. A healthy democracy thrives on self-reflection, on questioning assumptions, on respectfully but honestly debating the issues that matter most.
Couldn't agree more. It's not about having all the answers. It's about having the courage to ask the right questions, to listen to different perspectives, and to keep striving for a more just and equitable society.
Well said. And on that note, I think we've done our due diligence for today's deep dive. We've journeyed through the heart of Athenian democracy, explored its institutions, its values, its triumphs, and yes, even its tragedies.
And while their system may seem like a distant echo, it holds some surprisingly relevant lessons for us, even now.
It definitely gives us a lot to ponder. So until next time, keep those thinking caps on, keep asking those tough questions, and keep striving to make our own democracies the best they can be.